Thank you everybody for tuning in this evening to our first panel of Native matriarchs and leaders who will be discussing the importance of tribal consultation and what meaningful consultation really means to tribal communities. Tribal consultation is something that we deal with regularly. And again, consultation is not consent, so that's something that we will also be discussing. Before we get started, I want us all to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever we may be tuning in from within Turtle Island, that you are on Native land. I want to go ahead and get started and introduce myself. Talia Boyd and She, Torich Eatney and Shle, Toy Haglini, Bushes Chin, Glash Deshiche, Do Tobahan Deshanella, Akut Aldena Estan Ishle, Not No Georgia, Asia Hawan. Greetings, relatives. My name is Talia Boyd. I am from the Diné Nation. I was born and raised on the Res, and I am based in Gallup, New Mexico, and I am the Cultural Landscapes Program Manager for the Grand Canyon Trust. And I'm very honored to have all these wonderful, brilliant matriarchs here with us tonight, and I want to go ahead and introduce them as well. We have with us Judith Le Blanc, who is a citizen of the Caddo Tribe of Oklahoma, and director of the Native Organizers Alliance, a national Native training and organizing network which pursues tribal sovereignty and racial equity for all through an organizing strategy rooted in total awareness of the environment, past and future, and acting in harmony with all in the natural world and humanity in the present. She is honored to serve on the board of Illuminative and as a chair of the board of Indian Collective. She was a 2019 Roddenberry Fellow for Mini Wizipan Wankan, a set of strategic trainings to protect traditional cultural from the Keystone XL pipeline. Thank you so much, Judith, for joining us this evening. Next, I would like to welcome Theresa Pasqual. Theresa is the director of the Pueblo of Acoma Historic Preservation Office. Her work concentrates on protecting the cultural, archaeological, and historical resources of the Pueblo of Acoma. She successfully led a 3-year multi-tribal effort in the nomination and designation of Mount Taylor as a traditional cultural property. She serves as an advisor to the National Trust of Historic Preservation and was honored in 2011 to receive a Heritage Preservation Award by the New Mexico Cultural Properties Review Committee for her work in preservation with tribes. Thank you so much for joining us, Theresa. Next, I would like to welcome Ethel Branch. Ethel is a lawyer advising and representing Indian nations and tribal governments on a wide variety of issues critical to protecting and advancing their sovereignty. Ethel holds a bachelor's degree in history, a doctorate from Harvard Law School, and a master's of public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She is the former Attorney General of the Navajo Nation, where she was born and raised. She has also worked in tribal finance, served as bond counsel, and advanced Indigenous human rights. Recently, she founded the Navajo Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund. Thank you so much for joining us, Ethel. Great, and so I want to go ahead and kick us off and provide a little bit of context for our session this evening. Again, we're going to talk about laws and policies shaping tribal consultations, some of their functions and their limitations within tribal consultation. So the so-called dependency of tribes on the US government is really our tribal rights. As some of you may know, the trust responsibility has its origins early in the Marshall Trilogy cases. One of the things that Chief Justice Marshall said is that tribes could look to the federal government for protection. Protection from what we're not, they were never really clear about that. But protection from foreign nations, from state governments that are intruding on tribal sovereignty, and from US citizens who wanted to take away tribal land and other resources. As a result of that, there was an understanding that since tribes were ceding large pieces of land to the United States and giving up the ability to continue traditional lifeways, there was an obligation on the federal government to provide some services. There are 3 important components of the trust responsibility. First, the United States has a duty to provide services to the tribes and tribal members. That includes education and healthcare. Again, this comes from the acknowledgement that Indian land cessions that have enabled the US government to grow and develop. The second component would be the duty to protect tribal sovereignty. The government has a duty to protect tribes as distinct political groups to prevent state governments from encroaching on our sovereignty. The third, the US government has a duty to protect tribal resources, which sounds kind of silly since they were the ones who took control early on over our tribal resources. And today, obviously, we're in an era of self-determination where tribes have control over their own resources. Yet, unfortunately, many of our tribes only have remnants of what that prior control was. And the federal government is making a lot of decisions for tribes in terms of how our resources are used. And decision-making continues to proceed from a top-down approach that marginalizes Indigenous communities by dismissing our cultural traditions as irrational, while simultaneously imposing external values, policies, and actions upon Native communities and landscapes. This approach towards land management arises from traditions of Western European Judeo-Christian philosophy, specifically the assumption that human beings are capable of removing themselves from and controlling the natural world. So this goes into why Indigenous communities are often on the front lines of defending our territories, our sacred landscapes, our resources, and our rights from extractive projects and outside and corporate interests. Indigenous thinking is nonlinear, and it recognizes the universal interconnectedness. The timeless connections of our traditional homelands has never been stripped away from Native peoples, even through genocide and colonization. Native peoples have found effective solutions from generations of living with the natural world, and it is imbued in our traditional environmental knowledge and overall life ways. For many, tribal consultation is a mere check of the box, but there needs to be more. We need relationship building and trust building. So what is meaningful tribal consultation? What does it mean to tribal communities? How can land managers work with Native peoples to collaborate on land management and land uses? And what issues and opportunities exist? So in this session, we hope to provide examples of these numerous legal structures, guidelines, and definitions that dictate how tribal consultation occurs. And just real quickly, before we dive in, on January 26, 2021, President Biden released his memorandum of tribal consultation and strengthening nation-to-nation relationship. In that memorandum, President Biden states that respecting tribal sovereignty and self-determination are a priority of his and of his administration. He also states that in order for the federal government to fulfill its trust and treaty obligations, that there must be regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal nations. As part of this memorandum, President Biden also instructed all agencies to submit detailed plans of actions related to tribal consultation. He expected those agencies to submit their plans only after consulting with tribal nations and tribal officials. So that has occurred. And Secretary Holland did meet with the tribes. She did release a detailed plan on the implementation of the executive order 13175. And here is a quick quote from that piece. Acknowledgement of the long history of the federal government's relations with tribes is still needed. A history in which the federal government often failed to live up to the treaty and trust responsibilities that have their foundation in the US Constitution, much less afford tribes the respect owed to them as sovereign entities that preceded the formation of the United States and endure to present day. Tribes are not interest groups. Tribes are sovereign entities with Indigenous perspectives and knowledge that can improve the quality of federal decisions and result in better outcomes for all affected communities. Tribal consultation offers a means for weaving tribal input into our decision-making processes. Regular, meaningful, and robust consultation is an expression of respect for tribe sovereignty and self-governance, and is both necessitated by and integral to fulfilling federal trust and treaty responsibilities to tribes. And that was Secretary Deb Haaland. Thank you. So this is the context that I wanted to provide for this evening session. There is a lot of history that goes into this, and which is why it's important for tribal nations to talk about what tribal consultation means to us. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into our questions, ladies. And I will go ahead and ask Miss Ethel Branch to kick us off with question number 1. What is tribal consultation? And please provide an example of meaningful tribal consultation.
Sure. Well, you kind of outlined the framework for tribal consultation, Talia. I mean, I think that it's mostly rooted in the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act. And then President Clinton issued his executive order that you referred to, 1317.5 in 2000. And that kind of created a really nice aspirational framework for how tribal consultation should happen. It acknowledged the unique relationship, the nation-to-nation relationship, sovereign-to-sovereign relationship between Indian nations and the federal government, and sought to ensure that that relationship would be strengthened, and that tribal sovereignty would be respected, tribal self-determination would be promoted. And so it set forth a number of really incredible requirements. If you read through that executive order, it's really incredible. However, of course, at the end, it notes that it's not enforceable, which has created many problems. So even though it sets this really great standard that should be complied with, it leaves a lot of discretion to the agencies in terms of how they're actually going to comply with that. And so it's really a soft power tool for tribes when compared to something like a statute or a treaty. Although I think historically we've seen treaty rights unfortunately be treated in a rather soft power manner by the courts until recently. We have seen some really incredible decisions based on treaties relating to Indian treaty fishing rights. We have the case out of Oklahoma recognizing tribal sovereignty over original reservation lands. Going back to the discussion of the Clinton executive order, that kind of laid the foundation for Biden's memorandum. There have been essentially every president since Clinton has issued some additional guidance, building off of and reaffirming the Clinton executive order. And with President Obama, it's probably the first time we saw some real teeth. There was a deadline, a 90-day deadline for the agencies and departments in the executive branch to issue a plan for how they were going to implement the Clinton executive order. And then Biden has kind of followed through with that, reasserting the need for a plan within so many days, and then progress reports in 270 days, and then on an annual basis. And what we saw come from the Obama memorandum was the development of actual policies. And so many of the federal agencies have those policies. So again, there's a lot of discretion at the agency or department level in terms of how they're going to implement this executive order from the Clinton era. But if you go to their websites, you'll see the guidance, the policies that the agencies are supposed to be complying with when they engage in consultation with Indian nations. For example, the EPA has a pretty robust consultation policy, and it really varies depending on the agency on how robust their policy is. But that kind of lays out like when tribal consultation is triggered for that particular agency and how the consultation is supposed to proceed, like the timelines, identifies the points of contact, things of that nature. And a lot of times consultation is triggered by regulations, development of regulations or policies or issuance of permits that impact Indian nations. And then again, that's a tool. Consultation is a tool that I've used with clients in the past where, we have concerns about a project that may impact a tribe. And so we'll reach out to the agency and identify that, we anticipate that there will be impacts to the tribe from the project. and that we wish to engage in consultation. And that kind of takes us back to the policies that that agency has in place, kind of triggers that process. And it really just ensures kind of like an entry point for the tribe to have hopefully a meaningful discussion with the agency. But again, all of this is really, these are soft tools. These are consultation tools. Oftentimes you need to couple the consultation with something that's firmer, like a statutory right, and use that as a basis for negotiating for modifications in the project. But it's a nice entry point, and especially when an administration takes this seriously, takes the relationship between the Indian nations and the federal government very seriously, which this administration certainly has articulated that it does. So there's a lot of hope that tribes can make some progress using the consultation framework. However, there are a lot of bureaucrats in DC that kind of see this as a check the box sort of thing. So tribes definitely need to take those agencies to task and not just be okay with a Dear Tribal Leader letter and, kind of like the motions, and make sure that they're taking those agencies back to the policies that guide them, and make sure that those agencies are actually hearing the tribe and the input, and using that consultation framework as a basis for that agency incorporating feedback from the tribe into the actual final policy or regulation or permit decision.
Thank you so much, Ethel. There is a question. It says, Ethel mentioned you can see the requirements on their websites. Which websites? Are they each separate agency?
Yeah, so it depends on what agency you're working with. So if it's an EPA regulation or policy or permit, you would just Google EPA tribal consultation policy. Or if it's a project on national forest land, then you would look up. I actually think the National Park or the U.S. Forest Service has their own policy, even though they are within the Department of Agriculture. So unfortunately, it is kind of like there's not a standard across the board. The standard is kind of set in the Clinton executive order, but again, there's a lot of discretion at the agency level. So the policies, the extent to which the policies are fleshed out really depends on the agency and the agency's individual commitment to having a positive working relationship with tribes. So yeah, unfortunately, you can find some primers out there that kind of do an overview of all the different consultation policies that are in place. But it really, each agency or department has their own policy.
Yeah, and that's one of the things as far as, for tribes of navigating all of these different agencies and seeking consultation or trying to provide consultation. And this is something that we talked about in our previous teaching series last year about how a lot of this is piecemealed into all of these different agencies, and it's very difficult to navigate, and it hinders that consultation in many ways. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question, unless Theresa or Judith would like to add to that question on what tribal consultation is, or if they'd like to provide an example of what tribal consultation is.
Well, I would like to add that executive orders are not enough. That's clear. And what we see right now is the door is cracked open to change the character of tribal consultation, and that it requires that our tribal leaders lean into being sovereign, really lean into being Indian, because the door is cracked open. And when you look at the plan, the detailed plan that's been developed for the Department of the Interior, there's two major points that they bring up. Number one, there should be dedicated resources in order to ensure that tribal leaders and each department are able to conduct meaningful consultations. And number two, that there still requires a codification of what consultation should be, how it's defined, and how it is therefore mandated for every department. And I think I feel very hopeful that the nature of consultation can change in the way that we have always changed things. Number one, ensuring that grassroots people understand what consultation is right now and what it needs to be in order to move towards consent. And number two, that our tribal leaders, see that this is the time when they lean into demanding our moral and inherent and legal right to be a part of a consensual relationship with the federal government. So this is a new moment, a new chapter, I think, in consultation and what can happen going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Judith. Theresa, would you like?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add that we have a lot of talk now about free, prior, informed consent, which is a concept that comes from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that certainly would go a lot further than current tribal consultation. I mean, just that concept of consent, like you pointed out earlier, is very different. I mean, consultation is basically, triggered if there is an interest of the tribe, and then it leads to a discussion and input from the tribe, and then a decision's made and things go forward. It doesn't necessarily mean that the decision is going to be affected by the tribal input. Whereas in a consent-based model, the tribe actually has to say, yes, it's okay. Like you are proposing to put a dock into our treaty habitat environment that could prevent or impact the shellfish population by 30% in an adverse way. And we, because you're doing this other mitigation project, you're going to benefit that population by 30%. Therefore, we consent, right? That's really different from just a consultation model where the tribe is saying, you're impacting our habitat and we don't, we're concerned about this project. Whereas there doesn't have to be mitigation necessarily in the way you would have to have it in a consent-based model. So I just want to point that out.
Thank you, Ethel. Thank you so much. Theresa, would you like to add anything?
Thank you, Talia. I would add along to what has been shared by our panelists, the fact that we are now in an environment where tribal nations can ask for a shift in how consultation is done. I remember we have former Governor Kurt Riley, who once described consultation with a federal agency that it should be the series of conversations, that leads to relationship building, setting the stage for then being able to share those bits of knowledge that would help inform some of these processes. I would also say to what Ethel has shared regarding free, informed, and prior consent of tribal nations, that what also has to happen is the shift in those processes that come out of those federal laws, that those processes also have to change with what we are asking for as tribal nations. Our processes that are set up under both NHPA and NEPA, certainly most practitioners of those, at least on the federal agency side, oftentimes see it as very narrowly focused and not allowing for those components, not allowing for those discussions to occur that would set the stage for those things to change. So that's what I have to share, Talia. Thank you.
Talia, I'm sorry, but can I add just one more thing?
Sure, absolutely.
If a tribe has a very well-developed relationship with a federal agency or a department, there is the opportunity to request a specific consultation policy for that tribe. For example, if the tribe has treaty rights or has unique considerations that bring them back to the table repeatedly with that agency, or they have a TCP, traditional cultural property, or traditional cultural landscape. Those are all things that can lead to these repeat relationships with the agencies. And so those aspects can be incorporated into a consultation policy with the agency so that the agency knows better when consultation should be triggered. For example, if there's a project that may impact a traditional cultural property or landscape, or impact a treaty right.
Thank you, Ethel. Thank you, ladies. Great insights. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And this is for Theresa. Let's go ahead and have Theresa kick us off on this. How does the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, process devalue and disadvantage Native peoples' worldviews or perspectives? How can taking Native worldviews into consideration offer more affirmative and inclusive environmental practices associated with the NEPA process?
Wow, that's a huge question, Talia, one that we could spend all evening on. And I'll try and condense that. I did have a slide, and I'm not sure if it's available. I don't know if our tech support has received that slide there. There we go, that slide. And I want to share this with folks who may not be familiar with the processes that come both out of NEPA and out of Section 106. Of course, we haven't begun to discuss that, but each one of those acts, both NHPA, which was established in 1966, and then we have NEPA, which was passed in 1970, both have processes that come out of their creation that set forth for those agencies a mechanism by which to gather information, by which to identify that and assess the effects of whatever is being proposed, the action that is being proposed on those particular resources. Oftentimes folks will note that these processes, once they're outlined, are very linear, and they don't allow much room if we were going to get from point A to point F on the line. Don't allow much room for the incorporation of those resources that are harder to quantify. Many of these processes, specifically either in 106, which values historic resources and archaeological resources. And if you look at NEPA, which values those resources that can be defined and quantified scientifically, both of these processes have difficulty for inclusion of those identified resources and systems, value systems and relationships between those systems that are harder to define and quantify. Of course, most of this process is conducted in English. And we also know that many of our communities still have traditional language systems and a mechanism internally to describe those, which is often limiting when you're trying to translate those things into either one of these processes. So it becomes harder and difficult as communities move through, as tribal nations move through this process, one, to ensure that those things that are conveyed by tribal nations are being conveyed accurately in the English language, which has its limitations. But also there is the complication of time. Most of these processes have a time frame to them in which people participate and respond. We know that under the past or previous administration, there was a streamlining of many of these processes to get them complete under environmental review under Nepa, to get those things complete within a year. And we know that in many of our tribal communities, there are other things that tribes are having to deal with due to traditional calendars, traditional obligations, cultural periods within the community where a community can engage and discuss some of these sensitive issues. But there are many factors that begin to limit why or how effective these processes can be. And so as we were talking about previously about consultation, consultation is one component of it. Applying the process as people are moving forward and trying to, for lack of a better phrase, put a square peg in a round hole, sometimes that doesn't work. And so tribal communities, especially those that have tipple offices, or folks who are familiar and involved with these processes as part of projects, also have to learn those areas where they can begin to shift the inclusion of some of those items, but also strongly advocate for when an agency refuses perhaps to include those items in its overall assessment. Some of those challenges to these processes have, of course, ended up in court, and that is unfortunately where some of these may end up. However, I, in the course of doing this work, recognize that there is much at stake for our tribal communities, so much so that we can't afford to even not advocate strongly, even demand that agencies include those in their applications of these processes. So I hope this slide helps. Talia?
Thank you so much, Theresa. Absolutely. I want to go ahead and ask Judith or Ethel if they'd like to add to that question. And I can go ahead and repeat the question. How does the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, process, devalue, and disadvantage Native people's worldviews or perspectives? And how can taking Native worldviews into consideration offer more affirmative and inclusive environmental practices associated with the NEPA process?
Well, I can provide a little additional perspective. So under the Trump administration, we did have revision to the rules relating to NEPA, and that has kind of shifted the landscape a bit. It's made shorter deadlines. It's really expedited development processes that would otherwise trigger NEPA, and exempted quite a few of them as well, just right out of the gate. But one of the most important things that was eliminated from the NEPA process was consideration of cumulative effects of a project. And that, I think, I mean, for Indigenous peoples, everything's interrelated, right? Whether that's, you know, habitat, preservation of way of life, religious practices, cultural practices, all of that's intertwined. And so when you're no longer taking into consideration cumulative effects, then that means you're kind of looking at the narrow scope of, you know, there's a project on this 5 acres and you're only looking at, you know, what are the direct impacts of this project within that 5 acres? And it makes it harder to, for tribes to advocate for consideration of impacts to, for example, a watershed, where like the tribe is down that watershed and will experience impacts from that site that might not be considered direct. For example, if there are contaminants flowing off of that 5 acres that could potentially seep into an aquifer that's way further downstream that is a source of water for the tribe, for example. And so, you know, that's a huge impact. There might be a project that impacts species that are critical to for ceremonial purposes. But because the tribe is not, you know, that 5 acres is remote from the tribe, and the animal from that acre may or may not migrate to the tribal lands, it just makes it harder for tribes' cultural interest to be taken into consideration with these recent changes in the regulations with respect to NEPA. But overall, I mean, I think NEPA also, like, unless you have a standalone statute that creates more of a hook for what I would call a perfected interest in the property or the project. It's before you had a longer timeline. There was more opportunity to slow down a project and negotiate for mitigation measures. Whereas now things are a little more expedited, and that's going to make things more difficult in terms of using NEPA as a tool to negotiate with developers in order to mitigate impacts to tribes. So that's a big concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for adding that. And I just want to share something that off of Theresa's article that she wrote along with Dr. Thomas King and Kurt Dongoski. It's called the National Environmental Policy Act and the Silencing of a Native American Worldviews. So there's a little piece in there that talks about how environmental impact assessments under NEPA have become a business conducted for profit consulting firms and funded by project proponents. The consulting firms that do the EIAs tend to be run by scientist entrepreneurs deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. The federal agencies that require and oversee the conduct of the EIAs are similarly invested. There is little interest in or openness to alternative approaches to characterizing the environmental and addressing impacts on it. As a result, Native traditional views are characterized as having to do only with vaguely defined cultural resources and made the responsibility of non-Native archaeologists, historians, and cultural anthropologists. And considering such views is often done only in the context of ethnographic studies purportedly done to mitigate the impacts of agency decisions and regulated projects. And so I thought that was a really important piece to include in this specific question, and how that really devalues and disadvantages Native people's worldviews and perspectives when it comes to the NEPA process. So just very appreciative to Theresa and her colleagues in writing that article. And I believe we shared it in the chat. You can Google it and check it out. It's a very great read. Again, the title of that article is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the Silencing of Native American Worldviews. It's an article that was written by Theresa Pasqual, Kurt Dongoski, and Dr. Thomas King. And this was a few years ago. So thank you, ladies, for that. I want to go ahead and move on to our next.
Talia, if I can, I think one of the cases that really demonstrates the inadequacy of NEPA in protecting tribes and tribal interests was the Snowball litigation, where there was kind of back and forth. You know, the courts went back and forth on whether NEPA provided adequate protections to stop the use of reclaimed sewage water for snowmaking on the San Francisco peaks. And in the end, the court settled on NEPA not providing adequate protections. And that, of course, was used in conjunction with RFRA, Religious Freedom and Restoration Act. I think that's right. You know, there, I mean, it's like tribal interests are so huge, particularly when it comes to our tradition, our cultural beliefs, right? Or I don't even know how to say it. Like, to me, from when I explain it to just a person on the street, I explain it as like, these are religious beliefs and they should be protected the same way anyone else's religious beliefs are protected. But unfortunately, in our legal regime in the United States, tribal religious beliefs are not equally protected, because that would require protection of all land that is on this continent, because these are all our homelands, and every single square foot on this continent has significance, cultural and spiritual significance to Indian nations. And so that's just too huge for the courts to understand. And there's so much fear in terms of what that means in terms of stopping development. And so accordingly, you see federal laws that just aren't protective of tribal religious rights. And so NEPA just follows suit with every other federal law, unfortunately. And hopefully we are at a time where, where that will change, because certainly our religious rights should receive equal protection to anyone else's. And there, once those things are violated, there's no restoration. There's no same thing. I mean, it's so intertwined with protection of conservation efforts and whatnot to protect the land and the species, and whether that's species of animals or plants, because once it's broken, you can't rebuild it in many cases, unfortunately. So.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And this one is for Judith. Why is building Indigenous power and grassroots organizing important when it comes to defending sacred landscapes and tribal consultation?
Well, as I said earlier, I think we're in a very important, in some ways, what I like to call as an organizer, a magic movement moment in Indian country, where there's just an awareness that has been building over time about who we are in the 21st century. I think one of the opening shots of interrupting the narrative was Standing Rock, of course, where it became a global movement to understand not only who we are, but what we're willing to do to protect sacred places and to protect land and water. And that struggle was a struggle to protect water for over 17 million people who live, love, and work and play along the shores of the Missouri River. Not simply and solely protecting the sacred places and burial grounds of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe or its own water supply. And so we have an opportunity and a responsibility in Indian country to organize our communities to continue to advocate for our inherent, our moral and legal rights as sovereign nations. And the truth is that tribal sovereignty will never be achieved tribe by tribe, treaty by treaty. We're talking about a whole system change. And I think some of the conversations that have been had since the Biden administration has come into office are a reflection of grassroots Native political power. Look, we made the difference in the 2020 elections in 7 battleground states. And the grassroots political power and the organizing that tribal nations did and Native organizations mobilized communities who were living in the most infectious places in the country. We risked our lives. And in the final analysis, the Biden administration recognized the political power at the grassroots level. But then when you see what happened since the elections, is well, there were 3 Native people on the transition team. Huge, historic. There have been more Native people appointed in this administration than ever in history. And through grassroots political pressure, Deb Collins was nominated and confirmed as the first Native American woman as the Secretary of the Interior, which is one of the most important departments when it comes to protecting sacred places, but almost every area of life, from governance to education to healthcare. And it was not an easy, natural way for Deb to be where she is right now. It took tens of thousands of grassroots Native people and hundreds of tribes to advocate, to organize. We organized over 40,000 letters to the Senate to ensure her confirmation. It was not a foregone conclusion. And in Alaska, you know, Senator Murkowski is in a very tough election campaign. 20% of the population of Alaska are Native. And when 200 Native women signed a letter calling upon Senator Murkowski to do the right thing, to do what was historically necessary, to ensure that we are part of governing for the whole, especially in the Department of Interior, Senator Murkowski responded. She responded. That's grassroots political pressure and power. And so I think everything that happens from this moment forward is totally within, has to be connected to organizing grassroots people and working with our tribal leaderships to lean into our sovereignty, to lean into that we have to require what's necessary to fulfill our sovereign rights. So grassroots Native political power is the only way we're going to protect these sacred sites.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. And I always tell folks, like, this is Native land, and our land doesn't understand the English language, right? It speaks over 575 Indigenous languages, and that's what our land understands, which is why it's important for us Native peoples to be on the land, to give our offerings, to provide our prayers, and to reconnect with our homelands. I think this is why Indigenous power building is absolutely critical in moving forward and making sure that we're carving out spaces and making sure that we're being heard and amplifying our voices. So, this is amazing times that we're in. There's a lot of young Indigenous youth who are really stepping up to the plate and taking on, this immense task of environmental justice, social justice, climate justice. And I commend them. And we are standing on the shoulders of giants. There are many, many folks who have come before us, who have done this work, who have laid down this path and this road for us to be on today. And so I want to recognize all our grassroots community people who are on the ground every day doing the work, having these hard conversations, going to decision makers, educating them, lobbying them, and making sure that they know what's going on in your communities and how you're being impacted on a daily basis. This is critical, and this is what it takes to make our voices heard. And so, grassroots organizing is where it's at. And a lot of times we can't depend on our tribal governments, to do that. And so it really is that people power. It goes back to people power. and building each other up and supporting each other and making sure that we're staying safe in doing this work. And it's life work. It really is. And as Indigenous people, we know that there's a lot of sacrifice that goes into this. So thank you all for your amazing work that you have all done. And thank you, Judith, for providing that insight. It's beautiful. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And this goes to Theresa. I want to talk about TCPs, and we kind of talked about it a little bit. But Theresa has done some really amazing work around Mount Taylor in designating it a traditional cultural property. And so my question is, how are TCPs, traditional cultural properties, designated, and how are such designations utilized? How has this designation been used successfully? And what are its limitations? That's a lot of little questions there. Thank you.
That is a lot of little questions, and I hope I hit on at least a couple of them, if not all of them. And if I miss one, then certainly we can go back. The example that Talia gave about our work here in the Pueblo of Acoma relating to Mount Taylor came out of, as we have discussed tonight, came out of those very processes, those processes that we identified this evening. Processes that the tribal communities, as they were being asked to engage in consultation with the Forest Service on proposed permitting for uranium exploration on Mount Taylor. That experience by tribal communities involved in those processes led to internal discussions by communities that saw that those processes were inadequate. We knew moving forward with those processes, both NHPA and NEPA, that they weren't set up to identify those multi-layered connections that we have to place. And given the immense pressure and the numerous requests from the federal agency to a multitude of tribal communities to respond, we had to have, as tribal communities, our own discussion about how best to proceed. And so Mount Taylor, for folks who are not familiar, is a dormant volcano that sits due north of the Pueblo of Acoma. It's visible from Albuquerque and visible from Arizona as you're coming in on Interstate 40. But it also has provided the snow melt for many of the tribal communities and our surrounding land grant communities that rely on it for water. The other component that makes Mount Taylor, or as we refer to it as Kaweshtama in our Acoma language, the component that makes it highly prized is because it sits on one of the deepest and richest deposits of uranium ore. But it also factors into our cultural survival here at the Pueblo of Acoma, and for many of our sister pueblos and other tribal communities who have a connection to that living landscape. And so a decision was made to by 5 of the tribes who stepped forth to put forth resources and the technical expertise to engage in what we call the identification of a traditional cultural property, which is defined in under Bulletin 38 by the National Park Service. A nomination is multi-layered. It actually looks at various components, but a TCP looks at different criteria, and those criteria have specific definitions, which we can't get into in this short time together. But if you look under the guidelines for identification of a traditional cultural property, you will see that there are different criteria. I believe it's A through D, and each one has a unique definition that folks should look at to see if it meets that eligibility. Now, we know that that criterion was set up for those resources that were easier to identify, both as historical and as archaeological. We had to work harder as the tribal work group to define and explain those resources that didn't necessarily fit within those definitions. The Mount Taylor TCP nomination for us was also based on how that process of extraction plays out. We knew that the earliest point in which the tribal governments could engage in consultation was at the state level. So a decision was made by those of us here as part of the work group to put forth a nomination at the state level. The state of New Mexico has a register of historic cultural properties, which mirrors the national register, which is based in Washington with the National Park Service. And the keeper, that's his official title, her official title, is the one who reviews, along with their technical staff, those nominations which get included. What made this particular nomination significant was because it was a large landscape feature. We know that it was over 400,000 acres that were nominated. Very few landscapes make it onto the federal register. So we decided to pursue the state register nomination. The powerful thing that came out of this nomination process that I also want to highlight is the fact that the tribal nations themselves, the communities, author the nomination itself. And if you look at that nomination, the public nomination that resides at the state SHPO office, which folks can request and download, it's a beautiful document that is written by the tribal communities themselves about what they wanted to share regarding their relationship to that mountain. And that served as the basis for the full nomination. This wasn't outside entities coming in to tell us our relationship. It was tribal communities sharing with the public, this is our relationship with this mountain. And so it's one of the few nominations that I have seen that has been authored by tribal community members, but also includes our traditional languages in reference to place. And certainly when you look at the overall percentage of landscape features that actually get listed on the National Register, it is under 5% of those types that actually make it onto the National Register. You may actually see nominations where where you have mountains that are determined eligible, but the peak is only listed. And in this case with the state register, what we wanted to do was ensure that it wasn't just the peak of Mount Taylor, the peak of Kaweshima that was nominated, that it was the slopes of the mountain and the mesas that float away from it that constitute the living entity and encompass all of the multi-layered relationships that tribes have, but also included those places that perhaps one might not have considered integral to a TCP listing. And so those kinds of listings help as federal land management agencies like Forest Service or BLM or BIA or Park Service evaluate impacts of proposed projects to these resources, so they can be a useful tool. I will say to folks who may be thinking about that kind of project or process is that even if a site doesn't make it onto the federal register, a determination of eligibility, what we call a DOE, is also just as effective. In the event that that a group cannot get all of the landholders to agree to submit the nomination, which is required for the National Register, with Mount Taylor at the state level, we also had that requirement from the state, but we were allowed to carve out those pieces of private property and exclude them out of the nomination. But for the National Register, there is a requirement that you get consensus from all of the federal, all of the property owners for that nomination. I will say that because of that, very few make it to that final listing, but a determination of eligibility still carries the same weight as those that are not listed. So for folks who are pursuing that kind of effort, always keep that in mind. So I hope that's informative to folks out there.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that the TCP and designating Mount Taylor was tremendous work, and there were a lot of boots on the ground when it came to that. And I remember going to the New Mexico State Legislature to lobby for that as well. So thank you, Theresa, for all that amazing work that you did. And you know, that mountain is sacred to over 20 tribes in both Arizona and New Mexico, and so there was a lot of tribal interest in protecting it, and a lot of sacrifice and hard work that went into it. So thank you so much.
I will say, Talia, one last thing before we move on. The discussion before this was talking about activism in our community and grassroots organizing. I wanted to comment in that our experience with Mount Taylor, that we who work for tribal governments are limited in how we can engage and exert pressure. There are defined processes that we work with, defined laws and policies that we engage with. The beauty of activism in our communities is that there's fluidity and power that gets expressed in ways that we are limited as, in this case, in my role as the director for the Historic Preservation Office, are limited by how we engage with agencies. And so the power with community organizing and activism is that can be exert pressure in ways and vocalize those things of the community that perhaps we may not always get across. And so I think working in tandem with activism and community organizing and ensuring that our activists and community organizers also know the policies and laws and limitations of processes that we're all talking about tonight is integral into in strengthening their positions. On Mount Taylor, we had a number of community organizers actively engaged in protest. And one of the things that I remember in our work was ensuring that they had the facts and the laws and the processes in front of them so that they could advocate at the strongest level when they engaged in those public forums. So hats off to everybody who's engaged in community organizing and community activism.
I just want to say, Theresa, what you have said is exactly how important it is that we weave together tribal leaders who carry the responsibility of the negotiations and guaranteeing our moral, inherent, and legal rights. We weave together with our traditional leaderships who remind us of how and why these places must continue to be, and the grassroots who are willing to kind of put it on the line and be engaged day in and day out in interrupting kind of the narrative and expressing in ways that tribal leaders shouldn't and traditional leaders won't. The urgency of the moment. We just finished an initiative called the Red Road to DC, which brought over 17 tribal nations together to speak in one voice with one heart about the need for urgent action on all sacred places. There are countless sacred places. But the power of it was that we took a totem pole that was carved by the Lummi Nation's House of Tears carvers. We took it virtually and then physically to many different sacred sites that are under duress because of, careless development that has no concern for future generations, climate crisis and chaos, and the impact of extractive fossil fuel industries. And what the common experience was in all of these nations is that it was that wovenness of elected tribal leaders, traditional leaders, and grassroots organizers and leaders. And we brought it to DC and really had an amazing welcome from the White House and from the Department of the Interior and Deb Haaland. And I hope some of you will, and Fawn Sharp from the National Congress of American Indians, who spoke in an amazing way about the importance of moving from consultation to consent. But the beauty is that because all these sacred places have been organized, and some, the communities that have been organized, some from the beginning of time, were brought together to leverage our power. We had a meeting with Secretary Haaland that did include grassroots organizers and traditional leaders and tribal leaders, and all had been spending a few days in DC together talking about the ins and outs of consultation, the ins and outs of consent, and the need for legislation like the Respect Act, which kind of bridges consent with consultation and is a part of an educational process that the legislators need to go through, but also the grassroots. We can't just snap our fingers and have our sovereignty. We have to work within the system that exists in order to expand the democratic processes that can be utilized in the moment to protect our sacred places. So I really appreciated the example, but the participants in this webinar should know it is happening all over the place, where tribal leaders, traditional leaders, and grassroots organizers are working together. And I think the door is cracked open. and we can crack it further open to make our sovereignty meaningful in the 21st century.
Absolutely. Thank you, ladies. Yeah, grassroots organizing is pivotal in this movement and moving and amplifying our voices when it comes to educating decision makers and just the public in general. There's a few questions, but I'll try to get this last one. What is the tribal summary impact statement? Does anybody want to try to answer that real quick? I don't think I've heard of a tribal summary impact statement, but maybe not. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Let's go ahead and yeah, Fawn Sharp. Oh my God, NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians, amazing organization. A lot of the information I gathered tonight was from the National Congress of American Indians. And then Faith. Oh geez, what was her last name?
Faith Spotted Eagle, who's
Spotted Eagle. Oh my goodness.
Chicone elders, who was part of the coming together of the 7 council fires in the Horn at Standing Rock, and leads a traditional women's society called the Braveheart Society on a Haktuan territory, Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. I'm going to visit with her in one day. We're doing work together on trying to restore the co-management rights of the Yankton tribe, but all of the Oceti-Chacon tribes, co-management rights of the Missouri River bioregion. And someone had a question about co-management. Co-management is an opportunity and is actually happening in a number of places in Indian country, where it effectively brings the tribal leadership into the management of an entity. And in the Missouri River bioregion, there's a need to protect sacred plants and vegetation. There's a need to protect the quality of the water, and there's a need to gain access to the Missouri River, which is being used for profit by non-natives. And when the river tribes of the Oceti-Chacon have no access and no rights to that river. So Faith Spotted Eagle is an amazing leader who is really breaking some new ground in developing a model at the Yankton Reservation for establishing the spiritual and the scientific basis for co-management of the Missouri River bioregion. And she kicked butt in speaking on the mall about what we all need to do to come together for that level of native and non-native unity and alliance building.
Yeah. Oh my God. She is amazing. I get goosebumps every time we talk about her, but you know, she's a powerful matriarch who has been doing the work for so long. And my hat is off to her and all of these other brilliant folks who have been laying down the road for us. So this is great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Judith. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question.
Was there context to the question of what the tribal impact statement was?
No, it was in the Q&A, and it just said, what is a tribal, and oh, where did it go? Let me try to find it real quick. Yeah, what is the
tribal summary impacts statement? That is called for in the Clinton Executive Order 13-17-5. And so, you know, when consultation proceeds under that executive order, and there is a change in a policy or a regulation, the statement is supposed to be issued. It's provided to the director of OMB, and it's supposed to have certain aspects. And I'll just read it right out of the executive order. A description of the extent of the prior consultation with the tribal officials, a summary of the nature of their concerns, and the agency's position supporting the need to issue the regulation or change the policy, and then a statement regarding the extent to which the concerns of the tribal officials have been met. But if you if you look at the actual policies of the agencies, they don't always include this requirement. So again, it's an executive order, it's not enforceable. The policies themselves vary whether those are enforceable. But that is what that the tribal summary impact statement is. And that's the origins of it.
Thank you, Ethel. We have about 15 minutes left, so we want to go ahead and continue with our questions. This next question is for you, Ethel. And it is, what is the Antiquities Act of 1906? And how was it utilized in the tribal-led efforts to create Bears Ears? And how did President Trump illegally use this act to reduce the boundaries of the Bears Ears National Monument and the Grand Staircase Escalante?
Sure. So the Antiquities Act was signed by President Roosevelt in 1906, and it provides that the quote, the president may, in the president's discretion, declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated on land owned or controlled by the federal government to be national monuments. And it additionally authorized the president to reserve parcels of land as part of the national monuments that comprise the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. And that last bit of language is kind of the foci of the debate relating to Bears Ears. There was a lot of debate about whether the Obama designation was the smallest area compatible with protection of the resources. But there was a lot of groundwork that was underway in advance of the designation. There were 70 interviews that were conducted, ethnographic interviews that were conducted, that essentially provide the basis for the mapping out of a cultural landscape that was part of an original proposal for a 1.9 million acre designation. Of course, the final designation was 1.35 million acres, and it carved out, it was a compromise essentially. It carved out a region that was particularly rich with uranium. Fast forward, the new administration came in, and the new president said, I'm going to designate a monument in the same space, and it's going to be much smaller. Essentially attempted to replace the original designation, which was essentially a revocation of the original designation. And the Antiquities Act grants an affirmative right. It's actually a delegation of authority that Congress originally holds over lands, federal lands, and it delegates to the president the authority to designate a national monument. And essentially, like, the legislative history behind that is that the president can act with more speed to protect a site that may have historical, cultural significance much more quickly than, say, Congress. And so it allows the president to act quickly to protect. And then Congress reserves its authority to modify or withdraw that original designation by the president. And so there was a lot of fighting in the litigation over whether or not the president has the right to modify or reduce a monument designation. Of course, the tribes and everybody else contesting the president's action argued that this is a one-way street. This is a one-way authority. Congress never granted that reciprocal authority to revoke by a president the way, there have been instances where Congress has granted the authority to designate and to revoke by a president, as in the Federal Land Management and Policy Act, and where Congress does so, it does so expressly, and that was not done in the Antiquities Act. Anyway, so that is kind of the dispute relating to Bears Ears and kind of like the legal background. I'm oversimplifying to a significant extent. Let me look back at your question, because I feel like I'm missing answering Okay, so I covered how it was utilized, how Trump illegally used the act to reduce. And of course, the story of Bears Ears is very similar to the story of Grand Staircase Escalante in terms of what actually happened with designations and revocations.
Thank you, Ethel. Yeah, and that is we're still waiting to hear from the Biden administration, excuse me, on when those monuments will be restored. And so this is a part of us pushing on that administration, and the Red Road to DC helped express that message as well. They did stop in Bears Ears, and they also stopped in Chaco. And I was fortunate enough to attend both of those. And the Chaco event was tremendous. At the end of the Chaco event, there was this massive thunderstorm that set in right over Chaco. And it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful and surreal. But it really showed us that our medicine is powerful and strong, and that our prayers were heard by our ancestors. And it was just absolutely incredible. And this totem pole, it did a tremendous thing by taking our messages to DC, and it was absolutely incredible. So I wanted to share that real quickly.
So we had some grassroots fun. Theresa, you'll appreciate this. We put together ad trucks with electronic ads on 3 sides about Bears Ears. And we decided during the commuting time all day long to drive around the White House so that the staffers could see these beautiful poster that was done by artists from Bears Ears. And then we wheat pasted all near the subways so they could come and go to work and see the pressure's on. So we did a projection on a building of these beautiful designs of urging the Biden administration to make a decision. So we had some grassroots fun in DC last week.
Absolutely.
Talia,
So
I
awesome.
want to comment on activism and whatnot. We have this unique moment with the Native American Secretary of the Interior, and we have some questions in the comments about co-management. And I really do think, and we've seen some literature, there was an op-ed recently advocating that tribes be granted management authority over federal lands. And I think, and there's plenty of documentation to support tribal management of lands and the benefits that has to the ecosystems. Because we approach land management on a watershed basis, on a systems basis, which of course Western society is just now realizing is important. And so, I really think that there needs to be a serious conversation about the history of this country and the need for reparations, and how transferring authority over to tribal nations to manage federal land should be part of the right making as part of that reparations process. And there's really not a lot of time right now. We are in a pivotal moment when it comes to climate change. And I think transferring management authority over to Indian nations will go a long ways in protecting species and habitat, and making sure that this earth continues to be a habitable environment for all living beings.
Absolutely. Thank you, ladies. I think we've all said it, and we can't say it enough, that grassroots organizing and people power is where it's at when it comes to pushing and making this movement bigger, better, and greater. So we have about 4 minutes left. I want to go ahead and we have several more questions. I wanted to ask about NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Reparations Act. We won't have time to get into that. And I did want to try to answer a couple of questions. So let's see if we can pull some up. Let's start with this first one from Sandra. How has COVID affected tribal consultations in the past year? Have the virtual implementations worked this past year for tribes? Do any of you ladies want to try to answer that?
Certainly, Talia, I can attempt to answer that question. I'm sure, like most of you all, when the pandemic hit, it hit particularly hard for our tribal communities, some of whom lack the infrastructure to be able to connect the way that we are doing now. I know that in my own community, access to the internet was very difficult, not only for those of us who were trying to run programs and operate within these mechanisms, but also trying to respond effectively. And it's very difficult when many of our tribal leaders, as well as our practitioners and our tribal community members, express themselves better in person, as opposed to using this virtual tool that we have. And so it did create a bit of a learning curve for us. It did create a challenge in which we had to find ways to purchase some of the tools necessary to be able to communicate. But it also created a lag in response times. And so we had consultations that were ongoing that we needed to ask for additional time. And only until now, and in the case of my community, which has begun to slowly ease restrictions, allowing for program folks to come back and work in person back in their offices, has now created a backlog. And so we are in the process of trying to catch up. And of course, every project, everybody believes their project needs to be priority number one. And we just, we're having to ask people, ask agencies to slow down a bit, as our communities also have to navigate their own family needs. Many of our workers, my own staff, are dealing with children that are unable to return to school, or taking care of elders that we know have compromised immunity. So we are dealing with all sorts of things, and we are desperately asking federal agencies and other land management agencies to bear that in mind moving forward. It's going to take a while, and especially because we are not out of the woods yet.
Yes, absolutely. You know, there's a lot of projects that are still being pushed through, you know, the whole tech proposal in southeastern New Mexico, where they want to put a nuclear repository for waste. And then of course the Taco, they were still proceeding with public comment during a global pandemic, which was absolutely ridiculous in our tribal communities. We're like, wait a minute, we don't even have the time or resources to provide public comment right now. So there's a lot going on, and the pandemic has definitely added more obstacles and hurdles to that. And there's a lot of healing that still needs to happen. We are at the top of the hour, folks. So we should be wrapping up here. I want to thank all of our brilliant panelists this evening. Thank you so much, ladies, for sharing your time and energy and wisdom and brilliance with us. I absolutely appreciate it, and I know our audience does as well. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this evening and sharing your time with us. And please share what we've shared this evening with others. And this video will be shared on our YouTube channel, the Grand Canyon Trust and the Grand Staircase Escalante Partners. I want to thank everybody who has helped support this effort and who has really put in time and energy to be here. Thank you so much. I want to go ahead and close with a quote from John Trudell. No matter what they ever do to us, we must always act for the love of our people and earth. We must not react out of hatred against those who have no sense. And that was by the one and only John Trudell, one of my favorite writers. Thank you all so much for gracing us this evening with your presence. And please come back next Wednesday Same time, 6 to 7:30. We will be talking about free, prior, and informed consent. And we have some amazing panelists. We have Janine Yazzie, June Lorenzo from the International Indian Treaty Council. And we also have a staff attorney from the Native American Rights Fund who will be joining us in that conversation as well. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday. Thank you, ladies. Have a great evening and take care, everybody. Hagonet.
Yeah.